A recent retirement report from Scottish Widows found that 38% of people are not saving enough into their pension and are on track to have a retirement lifestyle below the minimum standards. But how much should you be contributing to a pension? Trying to work out how much you should be contributing to a pension each year can be complex and is different for different people. Much will depend on your lifestyle in retirement, how much you plan to spend in retirement, and how that spending might change as you get older. What's really startling though is the difference in pension contributions between the public sector and the private sector. So in this video, I'm going to run through some of these contribution levels and show you what type of pensions are achievable for different levels of pension saving. My name's Carl. Welcome to the channel. I'm a chartered, regulated and practicing financial advisor and also run a fund management company. In these videos, I am not providing advice, but just guidance to help you with subject matters including retirement planning, pensions, investments and tax. So many people still look at public sector pensions as gold-plated pensions, the gold standard in pension planning. Now in this video, I am not knocking the public sector, and this is not an attack on public sector workers. I merely want to show that if we believe that public sector pensions are the gold standards, is there a way we can replicate them in the private sector? What level of contributions will be needed to match those public sector pensions? Okay, so a public sector pension is a defined benefit pension, also known as a final salary pension. And these are very different types of pension schemes compared to a defined contribution pension, which is more commonplace in the private sector workforce today. Now, with a defined benefit pension, there is no pot of money that you're building up in the public sector. Instead, there is a promise to pay you a retirement income from a specific retirement age. Now, the level of income due from a defined benefit pension will depend on your average salary and the length of time you have worked for a particular employer. Now, as a public sector worker, you do still pay pension contributions from your salary. They just don't really impact the final overall retirement income that you receive because it's worked out on a formula instead. When it comes to pensions in the private sector, there will now mainly be defined contribution pensions. And here you are in fact building up your own pension pot. What that pot will be when you decide to retire will depend on how much you've contributed, how much your employer's contributed as well, and how well your investments have done. So as I said earlier, if we are to try and match the pension benefits payable from a public sector pension, just what level of contributions would be required to put into a private sector pension to match these benefits? Now, pension schemes for the NHS, firefighters, the police, etc., they all have slightly different levels of contributions that the employee needs to make. And these levels of contributions are compulsory if you decide to join the public sector pension scheme. Now, public sector pensions have had a complicated past, and there's been many different versions of them. So depending on when you join the public sector and join the pension scheme, you might be in different versions of the pension and have different retirement dates and different promises of income. But as an example, I'm going to run through a couple of public sector pension schemes as at today's iterations. So first of all, let's look at the NHS pension scheme. And you can see here that the contribution rate for an NHS employee is different depending on your level of salary. So this will range from having to make a 5.2% contribution all the way to a 12.5% contribution as your earnings increase. And you can see here that there's also an employer contribution rate of 23.7%. If we look at the firefighters pension scheme, we can see that generally the employee contribution rate is a little bit higher, ranging from 11% all the way up to 14.5% of salary. And the actual employer contribution rate is higher as well at 36.7%. And if we look at the police pension scheme, again, we can see the contribution rates for the employees are a little bit higher, ranging from 12.44% to 13.78%, with an employer contribution rate of 31%. Public sector employee pension contributions are taken from gross salary, so you do benefit from tax relief on the contributions. But some of these contribution numbers are truly staggering. So yes, public sector pension schemes are seen as the gold standard, but look how much it costs in contributions to achieve the level of pension benefits. A combined employee and employer contribution rate of between 28.9% and 51.2% of salary. Now, when we talk of employer contributions, this is effectively taxpayer-funded contributions. Most public sector pensions are unfunded, meaning the contributions that are paid today actually go towards paying today's retirees, paying them their pension income. The contributions are not stored up in a pot to pay later benefits. So the unfunded public sector pension schemes, like those we've just gone through earlier, are subject to an actuarial valuation every 4 years. So this process values all the rights being built up under the pension schemes and then adjusts for the level of contributions that are required. Now, what's really worrying is the liability for these unfunded public sector pensions. This currently stands at around £2.54 trillion, which is basically more than UK GDP. And what's really staggering as well is the level of public sector pension contributions when compared to the compulsory contributions in the private sector if you join your private sector workplace pension scheme. Because nowadays, if you have a new job, you're going to be automatically enrolled into the workplace pension scheme as long as your earnings are above a certain level. The minimum contributions for both the employee and the employer for a private sector workplace pension scheme are set by government. And these contribution levels are currently 5% for the employee. So 5% of gross earnings must be paid by the employee, and 3% of gross earnings must be paid by the employer. So this totals 8% contributions going in overall. Now, employee contributions do also benefit from tax relief. Now, of course, many companies have a more generous private sector workplace pension schemes and will also allow you to pay in a lot more, but nowhere near the levels of contributions that are being made to the public sector pension schemes. So we've seen the staggering difference in contribution rates for the public sector versus the private sector. But what about the actual pension benefits? How do they look comparing the public sector versus the private sector? Well, the Taxpayers Alliance have done some really interesting work and research in this area. And what they've done is they've effectively compared an employee aged 25 joining the workforce at the national median wage of around £35,500 a year, working through to a normal retirement age of 68. And I've looked at comparing the average employer and employee pension contribution rates for the private sector versus a couple of different public sector pension schemes. So if we start with the private sector, we can see that the average employee contribution rate is just under 6.5% of salary, and the average employer contribution rate is just over 4% of salary. So if someone does this for the rest of their working life, they end up with a pension of around £7,000 a year based on current average earnings. But if we compare this to the civil service, the NHS, teachers, we can see that the average employee contribution rates are not massively different, but there's a far bigger employer contribution rate, the taxpayer funded side. And what's really staggering is the level of pension benefits that are then accrued. So for the civil service, the final pension income that's payable in retirement, just over £25,000 a year. For the NHS, around £26,500 a year. And for teachers, similar, £25,500 a year. So for the public sector average, the annual pension that someone could eventually receive as a percentage of their final salary is around 72%. But for the private sector, it's just under 20%. So if you work in the private sector, you're probably destined to never reach the level of pension contribution as those in the public sector. But does that really matter? Remember, we are not comparing like for like here. Public sector pensions are very different to private sector pensions. Remember, it's defined benefit pensions versus defined contribution pensions. And defined contribution pensions do have a lot of advantages over defined benefit pensions. Firstly, when it comes to contribution levels, we don't necessarily need to reach those levels that are paid in the public sector because we have a secret weapon, the global stock markets, a chance to own thousands of the best global businesses around the world, solving society's problems with all that innovation, and we can participate in those profits. Again, looking at the average median gross annual earnings in the UK, contributing around 10% a year of gross salary to a pension invested in a global equity portfolio for the last 30 years would have achieved a return of around £590,000. And in retirement, even a 4% withdrawal would generate a gross income of just over £23,500 per year. Now, this is not guaranteed, and there would be some years where your fund would have crashed significantly, but if you'd have held tight, you would have been richly rewarded. So a £23,500 a year income from withdrawing from a defined contribution pension, together with the state pension from state pension age, would give you around a £35,000 a year income level in retirement, which is more than the moderate standard of living according to the retirement living standards. If you have a partner and they did the same, you could both end up with a joint income of over £70,000 a year in retirement, which is far more than even the comfortable level of living in retirement. Private sector defined contribution pensions are also far more flexible than the public sector defined benefit pensions. You can decide when to take your pension withdrawals from minimum pension age. You can adjust those withdrawals, they're very flexible, so you can start taking an income or withdrawals from your defined contribution pot. You could then switch them off, you could adjust them, make them higher, make them lower. You can play around with the underlying investments in your pension pot. All this means is you have a lot more control over your pot and can adapt it as your lifestyle changes. Public sector pensions cannot be changed once in payment. It's a one-off irreversible decision when you decide to take your public sector pension. With a defined contribution pension and control over the pot, you have control over the underlying investment strategy, and you're not impacted by the whims of government and public sector funding levels. Yes, governments do mess around with pensions, but don't forget, it's not all about pensions. Although they're specifically designed for a retirement, you can still invest in other assets to use in retirement. For example, building a property portfolio and using the rental income as your income in retirement. You could build up investments inside a stocks and shares ISA, and you could invest into physical gold as a store of wealth. It's actually a really good thing to diversify your assets to be able to protect your wealth. Should the government come looking for one particular asset class, at least you've got others to protect your wealth. I hope you found this video useful. If you have found some value, please give it a like, and feel free to add a comment or any questions that you feel you need answering. I do read all the comments and I'll try to answer as many questions as I can. And please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, as there's lots more videos coming soon. Until next time, take care.